Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to this third installment of mobile-friendly websites for small medium businesses. My name is Juan Felipe Rincon. I'm a member of the search quality team for Google, and I'm here to help you learn a little bit more about mobile-friendly design, learn some very simple techniques and practices you can implement on your website in preparation for our ranking change on mobile search results on April 21st. I hope that these tips will be helpful and useful, particularly for those of you who own small businesses who may not necessarily feel you are particularly technical, or who might not feel like you actually own the code of your site or can modify the code of your site. But and that these will prepare you to either feel that it's not as complicated as you might think, or have an informed and intelligent conversation with those who manage and maintain your websites. So let's get started. And we will present and move on. So in the last in this series of 4 presentations, we've been talking about both the tools and some of the techniques you need to use and implement on your existing website to make it mobile friendly. In the previous 2 installments, we talked about the PageSpeed Insights tool, the mobile friendly test, and the mobile usability tool. All of these 3 mechanisms that you can use to check how your site is being perceived by Google today, and whether or not we are considering it to be mobile friendly based on the criteria that have been that we have learned over the years represent a mobile friendly website. If you didn't get a chance to see that video, you can catch it on YouTube. The link to it should be in the Google Webmasters community, or if you go to the Google Webmasters channel on YouTube, you should be able to see the video for that. In the second installment, we talked about viewports, zoom, and plugins. That was really to talk about how to actually tell a browser this page should be presented a particular way on a mobile device. Today, we are going to be focusing on the user experience, specifically on the interaction the user has with your buttons, tap targets, margins, and font sizes. Let's get started. First, let's talk about tap targets. A tap target is pretty much anything that you expect a user on a smartphone would be tapping at with their finger. And when you look at a tap target, if you have a lot of small or tightly packed links or buttons on that page, it makes it very difficult to use on a smartphone. Think about that time when you tried to use a page on a phone, and the edit button and the delete button are right next to each other, and they're really tightly squeezed together. And all of a sudden, you try to tap on edit, and you tapped on delete by mistake. Most designers don't do that very often, but you'd be surprised at how often that happens. And there are very easy ways of avoiding that. The first thing to remember is that the average adult finger pad is about 10 millimeters wide. And this is fairly standard. And so if you think about the amount of space that a user might that a user's finger might actually be using when contacting a touch screen, it helps you determine how much spacing you need on the actual buttons to prevent 2 buttons from being pushed accidentally. So here's a good guideline to use, or a good rule of thumb, if you will, to use when defining the minimum size, width, and height for important tap targets on your site. For things that are really frequently used, we recommend about a 7 millimeter minimum width and or height for these tap targets. And if you look back at at our previous presentation, where we had the menu across the way, and even in the previous slide, all we did here was take the exact same menu and just change the minimum width, the minimum height of the element to 7 millimeters. We, in this case, actually made each of the buttons a little bit wider in the menu and just said it can take up to 50% of the screen. And we made the home button a minimum of 7 millimeters wide and tall. Another element to think about is that not all of the links on your page are actually that important. So if you have less important tap targets on your page, you should at the very least leave a 5 millimeter gap or margin between these targets to avoid these inadvertent taps. And this is something you can easily do in CSS by simply establishing that the spacing between these 2 should be, you can even define it in millimeters as 5 millimeters, or you could try to do it in pixels. But 5 millimeters on a physical device is a good rule to prevent overlap of your finger onto different tap targets. The follow-on piece is also about legible fonts. If you have a base font that is too small, it is going to be illegible, even with a proper viewport configuration. You are not going to be able to read it easily. And then you would necessarily be forcing the user to zoom into the page to actually read the text. Generally speaking, you should use a base font size of 16 CSS pixels when you're defining your page. This is a good practice also for desktop browsers if you think about it, from monitors getting bigger and bigger. But at the very least, for your mobile responsive design, you should think of a base font size as 16 pixels. And if you do want text that needs to be smaller or larger than that, then what you could do is set that as a percentage of that baseline font to 16 pixels. So consider defining a small font that might be 12 pixels and a large font that might be 20, but always in relation to that reference size of 16 pixels. The other thing to consider is that line spacing matters. If you have too much squeezed up text, it makes it difficult to read. Browsers by default implement a CSS line height, which defines that spacing between two subsequent lines on a paragraph of text, as 1.2 M units. And M is a typography unit that is proportional to the font size that is defined. That is a really good default. You should keep it. There are many the responsive design toolkits or even CSS practices that will reset the browser defaults to units of 1. You might want to look at whether you're using such a CSS reset tool on or a style sheet on your browser and on your page, I mean. And if you're doing so, then look at whether or not your line height needs to be defined more explicitly for 1.2 Ms. That'll make it much more easy to read. One third piece which plays on with these two is to make all of these responsive designs that we've talked about over the last 3 sessions. We've used style sheets, and you might use style sheets as well, not necessarily in the document, embedded in the document, but you might use them linked in order to facilitate maybe your development workflow. You might also have JavaScript files that allow your page to have more interactivity. The key piece to remember is that Googlebot needs to be able to render your site and recognize the mobile version of it. And specifically, you should check if your robots.txt file is allowing Googlebot to crawl your JavaScript and CSS content. If Googlebot can't crawl your JavaScript and CSS, can't see it, and those CSS or JavaScript files are important to make your page be responsive on mobile or operate well on a mobile, then Googlebot won't be able to interpret that your page is mobile friendly. The general piece of advice and the general piece of guidance is that you should treat Googlebot as a regular user. Then you should make sure that Googlebot can crawl your page if it's required for a user to experience it, and that you shouldn't be showing content to Googlebot that is different from what your user sees. In particular, if you're doing Googlebot-specific targeting or which generally speaking, if you're showing Googlebot different content than you're showing your users, it can be in violation of our webmaster guidelines as well. But you may also be unsuspectingly giving Google the wrong message that your page is not mobile friendly. So it's a general practice. Let Googlebot see your page as if it were a user, and make sure that Googlebot can crawl your JavaScript and CSS files. That was it for the technical element of this presentation. With the sessions from last week and with this week, and if you implement those simple recommendations, you can get a mobile-friendly page if you already have one and you don't want to have a separate website. Next week, we will talk about dual site setups. How about you have a special mobile site and a special desktop site? Do you have to do anything in particular? There are a few things that you should do to improve Google's understanding of the content in each of these pages and how it connects to each other. And we will talk about that next week. Between now and then, I would encourage you to take the mobile-friendly test on your site. Maybe this is the first time you've joined us, or maybe you've been following along with us. Either way, it will be good to check to see if you're making progress. We encourage you to read the Webmaster's Mobile Guide on our developer website. And if you have any questions, concerns, or other thoughts, or want to discuss with other folks in the community about how to make your website more mobile friendly, please visit our Google Webmaster Help Forums. They're a fantastic resource to answer any of your questions about how Google understands your website, and how to understand Google's tools and Google's presentation of your search results. We do encourage you to follow us on Google Plus and on Twitter. We provide news, announcements, and invitations to further events through there, and we certainly hope that you'll take advantage of that opportunity. And with that, thank you for today. We will look to see if we have any questions from you that have come into the Q&A. As always, my name is Juan Felipe Rincon. You can follow me on Twitter or on Google Plus if you would like, although the Google Webmasters channel will probably give you more consistent information than I do. I don't post all that regularly. And with that, let's see if we have any questions. We don't have any questions for today, but we do. If you do have any additional questions, please join us in our Webmaster Forum, and we look forward to answering them. Thank you very much, and good afternoon.